Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'm pretty loud, but I'll use the mic anyway. Today we have Tyson Slocum, Director of the Public Citizens Energy Program, and Matt Wald, Senior Communications Advisor for Nuclear Energy Institute. Today they'll be debating on, is there a looming electricity crisis? A debate on the U.S. Department of Energy Grid Resilience proposal. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you all. Good morning. And I know you're here to talk about electricity, but actually I want to talk about Beethoven. My wife and I went to the National Symphony Orchestra, heard Beethoven's Third. It's scored for 2 flutes, 1 piccolo, 2 oboes, 2 bassoons, 3 clarinets, blah, blah, blah. And I thought to myself, if when Beethoven was writing this 214 years ago, the price of oboes had precipitously crashed, would he have scored it for more oboes? The answer is probably not. The answer, first of all, is the price of oboes is fairly stable relative to the price of violins, et cetera, et cetera. But he wanted to have an orchestra. There's a limit to what you can do with oboes. Mozart wrote 1 oboe duet, and Beethoven wrote a trio for 2 oboes and English horn, which is an elongated oboe, but that's about it. Anyway, let's get back to electricity. I'm going to say some things that are not official NEI policy. NEI doesn't have official policy on some of this. We also have a really diverse membership group. We are rooting for action by the FERC to aid nuclear plants. It may turn out to be something like the Perry proposal. It may turn out to be something different. It's really up in the air right now. First of all, the grid's diversity, I do have some opinions. I reported on energy at the New York Times for more than 30 years, and you do pick up some opinions along the way. The grid's diversity is slipping away. Most people haven't noticed because we're having a quiet crisis. That is, it's quiet if you're a consumer, it's not so quiet if you're in the business. And the reason we're having a crisis is that electricity is cheap. It is really, really cheap and getting cheaper. An electricity industry magazine, Public Utilities Fortnightly, recently pointed out that so far in 2017, electric bills are 1.32% of household income. That's the lowest since they started keeping records in 1959. It's a little bit like getting gasoline really cheap. It feels good at the pump. It introduces other complications. At the retail level, what consumers notice is pretty stable prices because the utilities have thrown in costs for other odds and ends like smart meters, but the wholesale price is way down. The biggest factor here is fracking. Natural gas sells for roughly 1/6 of what it did in 2008. Why is this important to nuclear? Because in most of the United States, electrically speaking, we have a kind of obscure pricing system. We have an auction system with a clearing price, which means a computer, ours is located in a basement in Norristown, Pennsylvania. A computer lines up how much electricity we need, what price each generator is going to charge, and then every generator gets paid the amount that is charged by the last producer. If the last producer is gas, the price of gas is cheap, the market price crashes. That's what we've got now. Now, what happens when you get depressed prices? The answer is you make a variety of generators unprofitable. And this is slightly outdated. It's a list of plants that are gone. It's a bit like Jenga, by the way, which is it all works fine until it doesn't work at all anymore. Everybody here remember Jenga? Either because you played it or your kids played it. Once closed, they're gone. Look at California. On Tuesday, the California Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission started making noise about what replaces nuclear plants, and that's gas. As gas gets to be a bigger and bigger part of the situation, you become vulnerable to supply interruptions. After the Aliso Canyon leak in October of 2015, which required thousands of people to evacuate their homes, this is north of Los Angeles, California's had troubles. The CPUC and the Energy Commission said on Tuesday that if they get a 1 in 10-year hot summer, they're going to have to turn off people's electricity because electricity generators are at the bottom of the list. I should say something else about California. They're about to start special payments to natural gas plants to keep them running. It's not nuclear that's in trouble. It's all generators are in trouble. They're starting special payments to gas plants that aren't meeting their costs, but that they must have running to keep the system reliable. California has a near-term problem. We've had something similar here in the East in the 2014 polar vortex. It got really cold for days on end. Some of the natural gas generators have oil backup, but they couldn't get more oil. They weren't allowed to use the oil more than a certain number of days under environmental regulations. PJM, the market area we live in, used to stand for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, now covers a chunk of Virginia, Ohio, West Virginia, going on west towards Chicago. PJM lost 22% of its generating capacity. Since that time, more coal plants have retired. We're playing Jenga here. TMI-1 is on the edge of closing. Our electric system is more vulnerable now, and the variability of weather is increasing. The problem has caught the attention of the agency that sets the rules for the grid, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. They said, quote, baseload generation is not a requirement. However, having a portion of the resource fleet with highly reliable characteristics, such as low forced maintenance outage rates and low exposure to fuel supply chain issues, is one of the most fundamental necessities of a reliable bulk power system. These characteristics ensure that baseload generation is more resilient to disruption. Now, the Perry proposal puts us together. We're sort of an odd couple with coal. I don't represent coal. At this moment, I don't quite represent nuclear either. Obviously, these have different characteristics. They have different political backing, but I'm here to talk about nuclear. The NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Council, also said about gas, common mode, single contingency type disruption to fuel supply and deliverability is an issue. For non-engineers, that means only one thing has to go wrong and you've got problems. And before we get to that's before we get to the economic risk. I don't know if you have money in the stock market. Google's a great stock. Is there anybody here who put all their money in Google? Is there anybody who put all their money in anything? In 2014, IHS Sarah, the big consulting company, said that the diversified portfolio of the U.S. has a benefit of $93 billion a year. That's a lot of money. So here we are. I think I skipped a slide. Hang on. So we've got various issues. I want to address public citizen is rightly I hear public citizen talk more often about cleanliness than money. It does both. But they talk a lot about renewables. I think we need all the renewables that we can sensibly get on the grid, but we have to recognize that there are certain complications to renewables. One of those complications is on an hourly basis and a yearly basis, they don't correlate well with demand. This chart is showing us now one of these is a pointer, right? There we go. It doesn't show up all that well. Okay. This is over the course of, on the bottom we've got January through December. We've got solar peaking in June, as you would expect at the solstice, and declining. We got wind, which is strong in the spring, strong in the fall, not so strong in the summer. And we got demand aggregated off half a dozen markets peaking in July. They don't match very well. On a daily basis, by definition, you get peak at noon. Every electric system I've ever seen has a peak late in the day in summer. You get peak wind in the middle of the night. We need to think about how all these things are going to mesh together. What you need for that is a grid, and you need to have bulk low-carbon sources on the grid. This is about reliability. It's also about cleanliness. Depends on how you feel about global warming and Chinese hoaxes. And I think my time is up, and I look forward to
awesome. Thank you.
Top that.
All right. I'm going to load up my presentation.
Yeah.
So
I'll tell jokes while Tyson fiddles with the computer. Just yank it out.
I can just yank it
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Here you go. So I actually agree with some of what Matt just said, particularly when it comes to how inexpensive electricity is right now. Mm-hmm. And I would not, however, describe the current cheap era of electricity as a crisis. It actually is a tremendous opportunity for consumers. The only crisis that is presented here is for the owners of certain generation units who are not expected to earn the kinds of profits that they have been in the past. And so,
We'll give Tyson a timeout while he fiddles with the computer.
All right. Hello. How do I don't want that.
You can use the remote to toggle ahead.
But no, I want to change. Oh yeah, I want that.
No,
There.
it's okay. You got the full thing on the screen.
Oh, it is. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, oh yes. So, for the first 100 years of the history of electric power in the United States, electric rates were heavily regulated through cost of service, right? So there was no risk for a utility. It could recover 100% of its costs, and in exchange for that monopoly and guarantee of cost recovery, its profit margins were highly regulated, okay? And this is what we had for 100 years, and then in the 1990s, people said, the Soviet Union has collapsed, why do we still have communism in electric rates? We need to introduce and unleash market forces. And that's what we've done for 2/3 of the United States. Since the 1990s and early 2000s, right, we have had a grand experiment where consumers are now, for the first time ever, subject to potentially higher electric rates through the market. And in exchange for allowing companies to charge whatever price the market will bear, the risk was shifted, we thought, from consumers onto the shareholders of these companies. That was the grand bargain. Allow markets to do their work. And markets were extremely generous to the owners of nuclear power plants. Oh, I'm backwards. Hi. So in the 2000s, we saw that the owners of nuclear power plants in what's known as FERC jurisdictional markets were earning massive rates of return when the marginal price of electricity was very high. Nuclear power plants were able to come in, outbid everyone, and earn a lot of money. I'd never heard owners of nuclear power plant operators complaining about how market rules were allowing them to charge consumers too much money during the 2000s. But now, as Matt said, power prices are cheap and they are not earning money. In fact, they're losing money. And now they're saying, wait, we liked the markets when it worked for us, but now that we have to actually bear risk, we need to change fundamentally the way the markets work to shift that risk where it belongs onto the ratepayer. This is fundamentally an outrage, right? We're going to get ripped off because a crisis is being manufactured by an industry that is simply being outcompeted by new technological innovations, right? There are 3 factors that are driving this technological revolution that we're seeing in electric power markets. First is that renewables are cheaper, right? So I disagree with one thing that Matt said where he said generators, a lot of generators are suffering in these markets. Not if you own a renewable energy facility. You're making money because you are increasingly the least cost option in America's power markets, and that's why prices are driving down. I agree with Matt that the second factor is fracking. Fracking of natural gas has led to cheaper natural gas, which has led to cheaper fuel, which has allowed natural gas to outcompete nuclear and coal. And the third thing, and this is really important, is since 2007, demand in the United States is essentially flatlined. So without growing demand, you're able to meet generation needs or consumption needs with less generation. And that trend continues. And so, I don't remember in 1989 the big march on Washington by the typewriter manufacturing industry, right? Where they said, down with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they're destroying American jobs. Information technology is too accessible and too inexpensive. The fact is that history is punctuated with social and economic change triggered by technological innovation and deployment. That's what we're seeing across the board in so many different industries, and that's what we're seeing in electric power. And there's just my statistic on how quickly things change, right? Is in the early 2000s, very few people only relied on a cell phone. and now the vast majority of households do. You didn't hear a big outrage by makers of landlines, right? Because there are profound benefits for folks. And so this is just showing what's been going on in electric power markets, is that the continued cost decline for wind and solar has been absolutely revolutionary and unprecedented.
Okay, save that slide because I'm going to want to use it.
Great.
Okay.
Price history of silicon photovoltaic cells. This is just going back from the 70s. This is what we're seeing. Constant technological innovation that is leading to more efficient deployment of renewable. These are not Jimmy Carter's photovoltaics that were installed in the White House in the 70s. Power purchase agreements for renewables continue to go down. And this is awesome. This is a levelized cost of electricity analysis. This is done by Lazard, which is a Wall Street investment firm. And this is just showing how much it costs per megawatt hour to bring new sources of generation, from capital costs to operation and maintenance to fuel costs. And what you're seeing here for the first time ever, and this is their newest assessment that just came out last month, that shows utility scale photovoltaics and wind coming in as the least cost option in power markets. This is amazing. And this is just over time, again, just showing levelized cost of power. You see the orange line is solar, and that's what's driving these lower costs in power markets. And because it's lower cost, you're seeing more investment, more installations. This is another big driver has been corporate procurement. I testified before Congress in October, and next to me on my panel was the head of energy procurement for Walmart. And he told the panel that we were testifying on, he said, I am entering into renewable energy power purchase agreements not because it's the ethical or moral or climate thing, because every time we solicit bids to get energy for our systems, renewable energy is coming in least cost, and that's why we're doing it. This just shows global investment. It shows how far we still have to go. I'm just hurrying up because I only have a couple minutes. The big holy grail, right, is energy storage, right? Because the knock against renewables, rightfully so, is that they're intermittent, which means that they're not producing electrons at a constant rate during the day. Energy storage is becoming grid comparable, meaning the amount that you will pay for the capital costs and operation and maintenance of an energy storage system, a battery system, is going to be roughly equal to what the utility charges you to get access to the grid. This is the revolution that we're seeing, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance continues to show declining costs. This is what's going on when you combine cheap renewable energy with affordable energy storage. That's the holy grail, and that's what we're seeing in these energy markets. So what happens, right? Oh, this just shows flatline demand. Oh, and this is a really cool thing, just showing that per unit of economic output, we're using less and less energy. And so that's called energy productivity. So we're getting more economic output for less energy use. This is another big revolution. Now, some of that is because we're moving away from heavy industry, but the fact is that a lot of those server farms that are running our IT use a lot of energy, and guess what? They're all being powered with 100% renewables, because for Google, Apple, Microsoft, it makes financial sense to buy those. So what happens? What happens when, and this just shows fracking, that since the fracking boom, natural gas prices have gone down. So what happens when you have invested a bunch of money into a nuclear power plant and it's no longer making as much money, right? Do you figure out ways to innovate, to outcompete, or, I don't know why this isn't advancing, or do you change the market rules to put a thumb on the scale? And on September 28th, that's what the United States Secretary of Energy did. A radical proposal, the most radical proposal ever in US electricity policy, to say we have a reliability crisis that needs to have immediate intervention of the government to pay uneconomic generation units so that they can continue operating, right? This is nothing more than a political effort by uneconomically operated units to redefine risk, to shift it away from themselves and onto consumers. And so I can talk more in my rebuttal about exactly what this Department of Energy plan is and what some solutions are to it, because I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. So the dirty secret is Tyson and I agree on a lot of things, but not all of them. One of them is the market. We don't actually have a market. The only reason we have substantial wind and solar is we have two non-market forces operating. One of them is a renewable portfolio standard, which in various states and the district requires a certain fraction to come from wind and solar and assorted other sources. And the other is, remember I put up a slide that said within PJM the average price is now $18. The subsidy, is now $30. The subsidy for wind is $18. There's lots of times now when the price goes to zero and the wind producers are still making money because they're collecting $18 a megawatt hour from the government. That's not a market. We don't actually have a market. We've put our thumb on the scale for years and years and years. In the last 75 years, the federal government has spent $1 trillion influencing energy markets. Some of that's oil, some of that's coal. Of that amount, solar and wind and other renewables have got $158 billion. Nuclear got $78 billion. This doesn't count state expenditures. It doesn't count your electric rates, which give preferential treatment to wind and solar. I want to talk about declining cost curves. Another 10 or 20% drop in the price of solar won't help because the price is already so low. But we now have frequent occasions when the production is worth nothing. California now has a solar surplus and is paying neighboring states to take it off their hands. Yes, prices are dropping. Value is also dropping. We need to have an orchestra here, not oboes. We need to be realistic and integrate and keep the whole ball of wax in mind as we add or subtract generating sources. And when we get down to my industry versus your industry, we're not thinking globally in a way that helps our environment and our economy. I also want to talk about batteries. Elon Musk said earlier this week, he said that he could install 100 megawatts of batteries in southern Australia within 100 days, and he put a bet on it. And then he said, okay, we worked out, we did it, and I'm glad we did it because if we hadn't done it, we'd have lost $60 million. Okay, it was 100 megawatts, but it was 129 megawatt hours. If you go back and calculate, he's telling us that it was, you just had a slide up that said $273 a kilowatt hour for batteries. Elon is quoting about 300. Now, here's a glass of water. If you think of this as a battery and you think of what the contents as electricity, we're talking about storing 11 cents worth of electricity in a $300, or actually more, $350 container. Yes, you can do it. The question is how much of it you want to do. You want to work things out rationally and optimize for environment, et cetera. Now, I think actually this isn't the most radical proposal. I think it was probably the markets themselves. However, the radical, the idea that we used to make money, now we don't make money, now we're complaining about it. Well, companies like to make money, but the real question for people who are, how many people in this room pay taxes? Okay, how many people in this room use electricity? How many people breathe? Okay, we have unanimity here. The real question is, what on earth are we going to do going forward? I should also point out that over the years, many of these reactors have changed hands, but the real question is, what's best for society at this point? Some of these reactors are owned by profit-making corporations. Some of them are owned by companies that don't make money. Some of them are owned by the public. We have all kinds of, we have municipalities or public power authorities. We got all kinds of structures. Although we're now in a market, the electricity system is a national asset with national and international implications for environment and economy. It's a sort of odd structure. It's kind of like our cybersecurity problems. The most vulnerable stuff out there isn't owned by the government. How's the government going to solve this problem? So I'm 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours. So are we on 2-minute rebuttals? What are we on here?
Are you on 2 minutes?
I forgot. Okay, so what we need is to think. Let me not sound like a socialist, but we do need to think collectively about certain centralized assets. We've only got one power grid. I should also say, while Microsoft et al. Are buying highly subsidized energy contracts for their data centers, that's not what runs their data centers. I happen to know their data centers work in the dark. They work when there's no wind. What they're buying is energy. They're not buying power. You need both. These are two different aspects of electricity. If you've got solar on your roof, you are not independent. You've turned the grid not only into your supplier, but also your customer. You need somebody to balance that. You need the rest of the system. These parts need to fit together. We need well, I was going to say we need an orchestra, not a group of oboes, but we also need not a group of oboes going off on their own without any regard for what the rest of the system is doing. So, and the balance of the system, we hope, will be clean, low carbon. If we get to the mid-century and we cut our emissions by 80%, which was at one point was our goal, now it's a Chinese hoax, so we don't care about it. If we get to that point, we're not going to be burning very much natural gas. And we're going to be burning hardly any in microgrids because we're going to have to do carbon capture off the gas. You can't do that in a microgrid. You can only do that in a centralized place where the geology is favorable. We need to make this work together. There is space for more renewables, but we need to think about these things in a systematic way, and that's going to include keeping bulk sources online. And I'm not going to bother unplugging and replugging in the thumb drive, but at the moment, nuclear is still 60% of carbon-free electricity. Wind has been growing and dropping in price, but it's only a little under 15%. Solar is only in the neighborhood of 2%. Those things can increase, but we're already having trouble integrating the wind and solar we've got. We need to make these things work together. Batteries, we can all hope for better batteries. We should not build a electric system that assumes invention. It's just not a sound way to do business. We've got work to do. We ought to be doing collectively without sniping at each other over things that don't help the system overall. I want to talk a minute about this fantasy of an all renewable system. That's not your fantasy, but it's clearly out there. My house uses about 30 kilowatt hours a day. That's, if you think about it, if I wanted to go all solar and I wanted to be independent and not rely on natural gas or something else to back me up when the sun is down or when it's cloudy, I would need to store 90 kilowatt hours. At current prices, that's in the range of $31,000. And in addition, if I were going to go it alone, I'd need solar panels that could charge it during the few hours of daylight we have at this time of year on those occasions when we have sun. That's 15 kilowatt array. That's roughly double my total roof space. It isn't going to work. What's going to work is making it all work together. And what's going to work is marrying low carbon sources to each other in a way that makes sense. We can get more price drops. We need them. At the moment, neither wind nor sun is going to make it on an unsubsidized basis. We got to stop thinking of the market as something holy and tamper-proof. It is not. It was invented a few years ago, and it measures some aspects, but not all aspects of what we want. Among the things we want is diversity. The market doesn't price for diversity. If we live by what is the cheapest energy source and that's it, we're going to be all natural gas, we're going to be shaky, and we're going to be dirty. Take that.
Thank you very much. So we've established that power prices are cheap, right? The question is this inexpensive electricity causing problems in the market? Is the premature retirement of coal and nuclear generation causing strains on the grid that should be causing concern? So let's check that out. Well, this is actually pretty awesome. So a reporter asked Rick Perry when he was testifying before Congress about this proposal, and he was specifically asked, what is the cost to consumers of bailing out uneconomic generation? And he said, what is the cost of freedom? That these units are providing our freedom. And that apparently is the extent of the Department of Energy's analysis, because literally every entity outside of the coal and nuclear industries hate this proposal, say that it's terrible, that it's going to cost too much, because everybody that looks at this situation agrees that we do not have a reliability crisis. So this is from this year. This is from the Energy Information Administration, right, which is the statistical division of the Department of Energy. So this is statistics provided by you, the taxpayer. And this is an awesome graph. This shows capacity additions to the grid, new generation, and capacity retirements, right? And what the EIA found is that in 2016, we had the largest net increase in new capacity than since 2011. So what's happening with all these nuclear and coal retirements? They're being more than replaced by more efficient generation resources.
It's a math error. Go ahead.
That's talking about capacity, and I understand that there's different capacity factors.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, well, let's continue then. So this is from FERC. This is from their staff report. They do an assessment of how U.S. markets are working every year. They find record levels of reserve margins in every single FERC jurisdictional market. What that means is every FERC jurisdictional market has way more than enough electricity generation resources on hand to meet any sort of issue in the grid, right? There's a private organization that oversees aspects of reliability called the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and their now departed CEO testified before Congress in September, and he came right out and said in his testimony, even with all the changes underway, talking about retirement of uneconomic generation, the bulk power system remains highly reliable and resilient, showing improved reliable performance year over year. Our system is adapting to new technologies, to intermittent resources. Does it pose challenges? Yes, but the proof is in the pudding. Electricity costs are low. Consumers are benefiting. Renewables are cheap. The revolution is here, my friends. And the U.S. Department of Energy's own staff report from this summer concludes that the bulk power system reliability is adequate despite the retirement of a portion of baseload capacity and unique regional hurdles posed by the changing resource mix. And this was really awesome. There's a private group called the Rhodium Group, and they took a look at, there are forms that every utility has to file with the Department of Energy anytime there's an interruption, right, in electricity delivery. And they found that fuel supply emergencies, which is the cornerstone of the Rick Perry proposal, right, is that we have a fuel diversity problem. We need to have a diverse array of fuel sources for when something goes bad. We've got different types of generation units online. That for the time period selected, 2012 through 2016, fuel supply emergencies were the cause of 0.00007%. Squirrels are a much bigger problem, right? So the question is, why on earth are we talking about a multi-billion-dollar annual subsidy to help a handful of uneconomic generators when there is no clear evidence that we have a problem?
Because you picked the wrong metric.
You could talk about it some more. So as I was saying, there is united opposition to this effort, right? This is a coalition, and I'm not a member of it. It's called the American Affordable Energy Coalition. It includes free market, conservative Republican groups like R Street. It includes Advanced Energy Economy, American Wind Energy Association, ELCON, which is large industrial consumers. Their biggest member is ExxonMobil and their oil refineries. So even big oil is saying, we don't want to see this bailout, right? Because our facilities consume a lot of electricity and we want access to affordable, reliable electricity.
No, it's because they sell natural gas.
Well, not ELCON. ELCON is API. Yes, I agree with that. And I was very clear that there are three factors in this revolution. It's not just renewables. It's cheap natural gas due to fracking and energy efficiency. and flatlining demand. But here's the real issue here, is everyone hates, except for the nuclear and coal industries, the Department of Energy proposal. What the real concern here is what the private market operators are proposing. And on November 15th, the largest private operator, called PJM, which operates the electric grid basically from Illinois to the mid-Atlantic here, came up with its own market-based alternative to Rick Perry's cost of service reform. And the independent market monitor, right, who's sort of like the traffic cop for PJM, called them out in public and said, this is nothing but Exelon, the largest operator of nuclear power plants in PJM, that PJM is simply responding to its most powerful internal member and redesigning aspects of its capacity market system to increase their capacity payments by billions of dollars a year. This isn't public citizen saying this, right? This is the independent market monitor. And that's what we're seeing here. The only crisis is that there are politically and economically powerful entities that once were making a lot of money off of their facilities, and they're not making that money anymore. And so their crisis is, how do we re-engineer these markets to get us back to making money, right? And I completely understand their desire to do that, but it shouldn't come at the expense to consumers, right? I want to know where they invested their massive profits before the fracking boom. What do they use that money for? We've looked at it. They gave out big dividends to their shareholders. Their shareholders and their stock prices did awesome back when markets were conducive for them making a profit. Now that market conditions aren't conducive, they say, we don't like markets anymore. It's kind of amusing. So one thing that Matt didn't talk about yet, and that is small modular reactors, which some have touted as kind of the new alternative energy, that we can't afford to build these large nuclear power plants, that we should go smaller, there might be some better cost savings. Great Britain is ahead of the United States in terms of spearheading the deployment of these, but there are some major problems. And this is a Financial Times article from earlier this month, where there is a forthcoming analysis by the accounting firm Ernst & Young, or I think it's just called EY now, where they're saying SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors, are not cost effective, that there are huge cost considerations, and they are concerned about Great Britain sticking consumers with this experiment as well. So I've chatted a lot. I think where the solution is we need to fight these bailout proposals. I don't think that the proponents have done a good job stating that we are in a crisis. I don't see any reliability concerns with the current generation mix. In fact, I see nothing but benefits for consumers. I think that, so we need to stop the Department of Energy proposal. We need to be very, very cautious about what I see as the privatization of electricity policymaking. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has delegated sweeping authorities to the private RTOs, regional transmission organizations. These are the operators of the grid. They are not public entities. They are private groups, right? And they have very little transparency or accountability. Congress in 1978 foresaw these problems and actually ordered FERC to create something called the Office of Public Participation. This is in the Federal Power Act. It has never been created. Last year, I joined with 30 organizations on a petition to require the FERC to create this office. The office would do one thing. It would encourage public participation in these forums by providing what's known as intervenor compensation to the public. And Senator Howard Metzenbaum, who created this provision, spoke on the Senate floor in 1978 when this bill was going to conference, and he said, of this massive 1,000-page bill, by far the most important provision is the creation of the Office of Public Participation, because it will, for the first time, put the public on an even footing with powerful utility interests in the formation of electricity policymaking, by giving them access to funds to hire lawyers, to hire experts, to hire economists, so that they can make a case on consumer-friendly investments in our energy system. And I think if we're going to be debating these important issues, we have to make sure that the public interest is highly represented. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry. Well, actually, I agree with a lot of that, but the public interest is well represented. I pinch hit as a speaker at a ISO New England conference. They get dozens of people in every month. Now that you're firmly allied with the oil and gas industry, there's a problem here, which is we need to keep the whole ball of wax in mind. We don't need to get rid of all public intervention in markets. If we did that, we'd have no more wind and no more solar. When that chart you showed of construction of wind, there were precipitous drop-offs here and there. The reason is that's when the production tax credit expired. Wind only gets built when there's a production tax credit. Solar, you get a 30% federal tax credit and often a state tax credit. These technologies can't compete against natural gas except on a subsidized basis. Be careful if you call for the end of subsidies. The slide...
Let's call the end of subsidies for nuclear power. Let's force nuclear power generators to go into the private insurance market.
There aren't.
Insurance funding,
well, we'll have that debate in 2025. Meanwhile, I think actually that mode may get extended into the oil business where we need shared responsibility for oil spills, because someday it won't be Exxon or BP that has the blowout. It'll be some little company and there won't be any assets behind it. I want to talk about capacity. Capacity is a slippery concept. It's the ability to generate electricity. If you put up solar cells, obviously they don't run 24 hours. There's a measure in this business called capacity factor, which is how many megawatts of capacity do I have? Multiply that by the number of hours in a year. So how many megawatt hours of electricity did I make? Solar in this part of the country runs in the neighborhood of 16%, depending on the weather. Wind can run 30%. We're coming off a wind drought in the western United States. The wind machines went through years of producing less than people thought they would, because it turns out wind has droughts just the way rain has droughts. So you need in the neighborhood, if you have a 1 megawatt of nuclear capacity, it'll run roughly 92% of the hours in a year. And you plan when you shut it down. You shut it down in the spring and fall when demand is slow, when you need to reload, refuel, etc. So for every 1 megawatt of nuclear to make the same amount of energy, you need roughly 3 megawatts of wind or 6 megawatts, 7 megawatts of solar. Capacity is not a favorable measure to look at how the system runs. Otherwise, you'll be sitting there in the middle of a dark night saying, I've got all this solar outside, why aren't the lights on? Tyson made reference to NERC. NERC actually, you've quoted rather selectively. NERC says we've got supply chain issues. NERC says it doesn't matter how much generating capacity you have if you can't get fuel to the generators. In order to have a balanced system, you need some generators that are not vulnerable to fuel supply issues. We need to keep that in mind. Otherwise, you'll have theoretical lights on and actual lights off. The same is true of having more than enough generation on hand. Electricity doesn't come from generation. It comes from generation plus fuel plus delivery. And on the idea that it's, am I going to miss a 0.0007% is supply interruptions, that's true, but if you measure the interruptions by raw number, most of it is the squirrel in the tree right outside your door. Most interruptions are a house, a half a dozen houses, a neighborhood. What we're talking about here is the bulk power system. And what NERC says, NERC is a quasi-public entity. It's empowered by the US government to do this stuff. What NERC says is we've got a bulk power system threat and we need to keep our eye on this. National Academy of Sciences says that the kilowatt hour you don't have is worth about $5. It took the 2003 blackout. It looked at the amount of productivity that was lost because the lights were out. This is one that went from Detroit to New York. And the number of megawatt hours not used. Kilowatt hour sells for about 11 cents. When you don't have it, it's worth $5. I have a fire extinguisher in my kitchen. Chances are good I'm never going to use it. Chances are good I wasted the money that I spent to put it there, but I still have the fire extinguisher in my kitchen. Electricity turns out to be more important than the fire extinguisher. We need a balanced system. The past is past. I don't have an opinion on whether there should be public funding for the market entities. The market entities, though, are not really private. They are multi-party. The people already involved there I have good news. They hate each other's guts. They claw at each other, etc. You're asking to add another party, which may be a good idea, but I don't think it's correct to say that they have big corporate interests at heart. Among the interests in play there are the generators, the transmitters, the utility companies that no longer generate. They simply supply consumers, and big industrial consumers and private consumers. I will end.
How much time do we have?
Should we take some
Yeah,
questions?
definitely questions.
Yeah,
But when is this supposed to end? Oh, here, I've got something here.
It's already Saturday morning. We've talked for
Right,
hours.
exactly. And the door's locked. We're not getting out. Well, let's just go with some questions.
Well, yeah, please.
I'll double check, but I have until 12.
You talked a lot about reliability, and I think resilience came up exactly once.
Hold on.
Wind and solar are great, but the electric grid is a strategic national asset. And it's threatened right now by the North Koreans, who have threatened to detonate an EMP over the United States. And there's also cybersecurity issues and physical security issues. And I think one of the things behind this order from Perry is resilience. And if you have a dual fuel capability, then the plant can operate in a much more resilient
What's the question?
That we haven't addressed resilience.
that you haven't resilience. That's the question.
So I came here by taxi. My ability to get back by taxi does not depend on the reliability of the car that brought me here. It depends on finding a taxi. We do have some dual fuel generating capacity in the system, but as NERC points out, often it doesn't work. You can't bring in enough oil. You can't, that's what happened in the polar vortex. You can't burn the oil for more than a certain number of days because of environmental regulations. A better form of resilience is diversity in supply. Nuclear plants can run for many months uninterrupted.
Yeah, so great question. So first, the Secretary of Energy's proposal doesn't do anything for improving grid resilience. The Secretary of Energy is looking at a unit-by-unit measure of resilience and says we will pay significant amounts of money for national security reasons to currently uneconomic generators that can demonstrate that they have on-site fuel supplies of at least 90 days. So that means a coal pile. That means nuclear fuel. The problem is, and I laid this out in my congressional testimony last month, is that having on-site fuel, there is no correlation whatsoever with reliability. And a perfect example was the hurricane that hit Texas. The largest coal generator in the state of Texas, operated by a company called NRG, saw its coal piles submerged underwater and unusable. So it had 90 days of on-site fuel supply that was rendered useless. You have pipeline issues that have trouble getting gas. So a good friend of ours, Amory Levins, who runs the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado, said, why on earth are we talking about a unit-by-unit resilience model? We need to look at system resilience. And how do we achieve optimal system resilience, whether it's protection from EMP, whether it's protection from malicious hacking, from accidents? A decentralized system
right, that is anchored by renewables, but also by fuel cells or natural gas or, small modular reactors if they can be affordable. The problem with the 2003 power outage was you had this cascading domino effect where an entire grid was literally shut down from what was a single event. And
Not exactly, but go ahead.
so there are aspects, and there's a number of studies done by Amory Levins, but a number of other analysts as well, that say when you've got a more decentralized system, you are actually far more resilient to these kinds of attacks because you are more localizing that event, right? So you are not having this cascade effect. So I think that the problem is that the Secretary of Energy, and I'm sure Rick Perry is a fine individual. I don't know him personally. But I think one thing that I think could be safely said is that he will never be mistaken for an intellectual giant, right? He's been a very public figure for a long time, and he's never really made a lot of public statements that have impressed me from an intellectual standpoint. I'm not trying to beat up on Secretary Perry. I'm just stating my belief. And his proposal is just not well thought out. It is using bad metrics. It is using bad assumptions of resiliency. And I heard some of the discussion this morning about Puerto Rico. What I didn't hear, why on earth are we talking about an island like Puerto Rico that has access to zero fossil fuel resources? Why are we rebuilding an energy infrastructure that continues to have it dependent upon imported fossil fuel resources? If we want to talk about resilience in the Puerto Rican electricity grid, we have to completely re-engineer it to be a renewable, decentralized grid, right? That's what Hawaii is doing. The state of Hawaii is moving the most aggressively, even more aggressively than California, towards renewables because they have to, because electricity has been historically very expensive there because getting non-native fuel sources to an island is extremely expensive. What is the most available fuel source? It's renewables, right? They're not perfect. There are issues with them, right? But they are extremely superior in a lot of different metrics because the access to that fuel supply and its cost.
When you get into decentralized energy, you kiss wind goodbye. Wind is about 7 or 8 times larger than solar. Wind is lower cost. Wind is a major contributor to reducing our carbon emissions and other emissions. There are a lot of reasons to like wind. Wind only works on a big scale. Little wind machines cost a lot and don't make a lot of electricity. You need a tower that's extremely tall. You need to cluster them in groups. That means a grid. So I'm sorry you've called for an end to wind production in the United States. Maybe the oil and gas guys put you up to it.
But am not in any coalition, nor do I receive any financial.
I'm sure. I'm just pulling your leg. But cleanliness next to godliness, small is not always beautiful. Big is sometimes beautiful. A big system has advantages. That's so you can put solar in the desert where it's really sunny and deliver it to where people live. That's where you can put wind machines in windy places. We really need to. We have a hostility to the grid. We have this fantasy that rooftop solar is going to solve the world's problems. Puerto Rico is burdened with extremely high prices, but at $350 a kilowatt hour to store electricity, there's a limit to how much Puerto Rico can afford. I think it'd be a wonderful place for a small modular reactor. And in fact, a small modular reactor would be competitive first there because it's competing against imported fuel oil. Small modular reactors are going to do more than electricity. By the way, Britain is not in the lead. They may be moving forwards towards deployment. There's an American company that has a contract to build one in Idaho in the next few years. Small modular reactors are going to help decarbonize the whole system. They're a suitable size to run a steel mill, a refinery, a chemical plant, a variety of other non-electric sources. You use the direct heat. There's a lot of innovation going on in nuclear, and that's part of it. Sure.
I just find it awesome that two of you, so knowledgeable and reasonable.
We're not reasonable.
Did you impact each other being here? Do you have some ideas of some areas of policy that you might advocate that you didn't have before you started this discussion?
This is partly a repeat performance. We were in New Orleans at the...
Earlier this year, we actually debated this issue at Tulane University.
All right, we're going to become a road show. We're going to sell
I will go back to New Orleans anytime they ask. I'll speak at a community college in New Orleans.
We do have some points of view in common, and we have some differing perceptions. The energy world, maybe you'll agree with me, is a Rorschach test. People look at it, and you remember Rorschach, it was about 100 years ago, the psychologist did these drawings, and the joke is, who is this guy Rorschach, and why is he showing pictures of my parents arguing with each other? You know, what you see in it depends more on your background than on what's actually there. But yeah, we have some areas of agreement.
I'm sure if we talk some more, I mean, we happen to be debating an issue where I think we are not in agreement on the policy issues, but I'm sure if we had a broader discussion about energy issues, I think we both want to see, I'm sure we both believe in the science of climate change and understand that low and no carbon energy resources are needed. We will probably have a disagreement about the involvement of nuclear power in that scenario, but I see climate change as a very serious issue that where we probably have agreement.
I have a point to add to that, which is you decarbonize by replacing high carbon sources with no carbon sources. You don't decarbonize by replacing no carbon sources with other no carbon sources. That doesn't work very well. If you think that we need to kiss nuclear goodbye and bring on wind and solar, first of all, solar is higher carbon than nuclear. And second of all, let's talk about how we're going to replace the carbon sources, not replace no carbon sources. Other questions? I should let the moderator choose the questioners, otherwise, the moderators union will come after me afterwards.
Thank you both. I have a question, but I had a quick comment. You mentioned the R Street Institute and their opposition to the NOPR, but they did come out in their comment that they supported the idea of the NOPR if it was implemented in a more market-oriented way in terms of some sort of carve-out for resiliency. And I just think it would be fair that point is made since you mentioned them explicitly. But I have a question for you also, and that is, you talked a lot about decreasing costs, levelized costs of electricity. You also advocated strongly for market solutions, which I really appreciate. But I had a question if you thought about long-term, if there is not a dramatic reduction in the cost of storage, how the profitability, not the cost, the profitability of wind and solar would progress in the long term when these generators put out output in a very coordinated fashion and could essentially depress the prices that they are receiving far below even the average cost of energy.
I think it's a great question. There is a lot riding on energy storage. That there's no question that, right now deployment levels of renewables are high in some markets like California, but uniformly across the country, for the most part, penetration rates are fairly low. If you're going to start to see significant ramp up of intermittent resources, it necessitates big energy storage investments, absolutely. The projections right now are for cheaper, but I actually agree with Matt where I can't remember how you phrased it, but it was better than the way I would phrase it. But something like, you can't make future plans based upon something that isn't tangible right here. It isn't an outrage to say we can have expectations of affordable energy storage going forward, but we better be sure that it's going to be there. We're seeing in some places energy storage, is bidding into aspects of the California ISO market. It's playing a role, but definitely cheap batteries and other forms of energy storage is going to be key. One of my slides, I think, called it the Holy Grail. And people have been talking about it for a long time, but it really is the key. I mean, it's the key for these things, right? I mean, for a while, there was no corresponding Moore's law for the battery, right? So the microprocessors in this thing, right, which is which is more powerful than the mainframes that sent a man to the moon in '69 that couldn't even fit in this house, right? And this thing fits in my pocket, right? This is a remarkable engine of innovation. And I got to check Facebook. Hold on. No. But we're starting to see those advances. But that's a great question, and I hope I answered it.
Storage would be good for nuclear. Storage would be good for lots of things. There is no Moore's law for batteries, alas. And if I could get all of the ingredients of a lithium atom battery, wave my magic Tinkerbell wand, and it assembles itself into a battery, free, you still couldn't afford it. However, people in this room will remember NiCad batteries, nickel metal hydride batteries. It's not clear if lithium ion is the future. There may be some other chemistry out there, some step change, but we agree it ain't there now. If I had a solar panel and I were looking for the best place to put it, I might put it in some jurisdiction where there weren't many solar panels and there was lots of coal. But that's not where it's actually going. It's going into a place like California where there's no coal and too many solar panels already, because in spring and fall, not too many, but in spring and fall you drive the price down to zero, and that's not an economic benefit. Same is true in wind. We tend to put them where the transmission is, where they can get the zoning, not always perfect for the whole system, not getting maximum benefit. Now, if it's a private company, that's one thing. If tax policy is subsidizing the deployment of any energy resource, then we need to keep the whole system in mind, and we don't do that at present. We do have a recognized phenomenon of intermittent renewables crowding each other out, and there's also a contradiction here, which is the way to solve that problem is to make the grid bigger. We want to be careful about the idea of making the grid smaller, of breaking it up. It may have positive reliability implications, it may not, but it has negative implications for big generators, including intermittent renewables.
There was another question? Yeah, the gentleman in red.
Jack Warner with Climate Institute. Just on your comment about batteries, right now there's ultracapacitor battery technology that's coming online that's going to, surpass what's going on with lithium ion. But we just held a conference at GW on the concept of a North American supergrid, which is the installation of a high voltage direct current overlay transmission system of our existing system to address all of the issues that you've been bringing up today, that each of you brought in terms of how and where renewables can be brought into the system, how it can be moved around, how to deal with resilience, and in many cases, in most cases, with the study we've done already, it shows that by putting underground cabling in, that you can really deal with a lot of other issues. So I just want to see if you guys had thought about that. If you looked at our concept, we had the conference in GW on Wednesday. It's based on a paper that Sandy McDonald did, from former NOAA, director of NOAA's lab, and the concept of having this national, basically, network. So it's like comparable to what we did with the cars and the highways that Eisenhower did and so forth.
I'm embarrassed to say I'm not familiar with this specific proposal, so I can get your info. I'm sorry I missed the conference on Wednesday, but I would be extremely happy to take a look at it. I'm not familiar with it. But with your Eisenhower reference, my last slide in my presentation, actually, I went through kind of the history of government interventions in infrastructure, and it starts with Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, right, where it says Congress shall build the postal roads, right, which was kind of the first internet and transport system. Continuing through the telegraph, Congress, underwrote more than 90% of telegraph infrastructure. Same thing with the railroads. All the land that was given for free to the railroads, along with low interest, very long-term bonds to the railroads. 1956 Highway Act radically transformed America's transportation infrastructure at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars when you look at the new gas tax appropriations, but it was something that was needed. And it had profound impacts. Less than a decade after the 56 Act, we had turned from an oil exporting nation to an oil importing one. Now that was probably going to change anyway because of the post-war boom and the nature of the automobile industry, but there's no question that the interstate roads vastly facilitated that. So I think that there is a need for infrastructure investments. When you look at the electrification of the transport sector, I'm sure that's something where Public Citizen and NEI would probably be in support, because the more electrification you have of the transportation system, the more need for electric power. So I'm sure that the Nuclear Energy Institute would be supportive of expansion of the electrification of transport.
I think we are. I'd have to go back and look. It sounds like a good idea to me. There have been proposals. I'm not familiar with the conference. I've seen previous proposals for mixed AC and DC systems. There's been an explosion in DC transmission links lately. A lot of them submarine transmission links. A recent one that goes from Pittsburgh, California, into in the East Bay into San Francisco, and allowed them to eliminate a cluster of old, dirty natural gas plants in downtown, in the central city of San Francisco. You can do a lot with AC. Texas showed you can do a lot with AC. You tend to get into turf wars in transmission, but generally, if you want a clean, economical system, transmission is good for you.
Other questions?
With the increasing popularity of electric vehicles, do you think that would put a significant strain on the power grid? Or do you think we have a good way of solving that issue through subsidies of some kind, potentially?
Thank goodness, an easy question. Thank you. One of the problems with electricity is it's very hard to store. We've been coming at that from a different angle. If you can charge the electric vehicles at night, there's a whole lot of spare capacity at night. It would be as if you were moving traffic off New Hampshire Avenue out here, relieving some of the congestion at 5 p.m. by doing it at 5 a.m. instead. However, it's never exactly clear when the vehicle is going to get charged. You need a smart infrastructure to do that. We can, in fact, do that.
Yeah, and I think, one thing is the current automobile use by most individuals is extremely inefficient, meaning your automobile is being unused for a majority of the time. So I'm looking out the window right now, and there's a bunch of traffic right now, but there's also a bunch of cars that are sitting at homes, in parking garages, on streets throughout DC. If you have a high rate of electric vehicle penetration into a city like this, and you've got a networked charging structure, those parked, fully charged vehicles sitting in parking garages actually become a power station, right? During peak hours, you've got basically a massive energy storage system in a parking garage. Obviously, it's a dynamic one where you've got comings and goings, but given the use of the vast majority of individual transport vehicles, the fact that they remain unused for large portions of the day, to provide financial incentives through rate structures to do that charging off-peak, meaning at night when power demand can sometimes be half of what it is, say, at peak, like right now. I think that the introduction of EVs actually provides more opportunities than challenges. But again, it's going to take, and there was a panel just before this on driverless cars, it's going to take a lot of infrastructure investment to get EVs to function in the way that I'm describing, right? But it's absolutely, we are moving towards a EV future. You've got so many countries, so many automakers making these pledges because they're looking at the technology, they're looking at the cost structure, they're looking at the integration with other systems, and they're like, this is where we see the future of the drivetrain. And so that's where we're moving towards.
It's all good, but American sales of EVs are still well below 1% of the market. And frankly, if I owned one, and I'd like to own one, I'm not sure you could induce me to wear out my battery sooner and cut my potential range by selling electricity back to the grid. The price would have to be pretty high. I mean, would you do that with your cell phone or your laptop? No.
Well, in exchange for getting, say, a free access to a charger, that would be part of the deal. So you wouldn't be charged, say, for charging your vehicle, and in exchange, your vehicle is helping integrate with the grid.
Let me do a little wordplay on the idea of too cheap to meter, which is often attributed to the nuclear industry, but it isn't. It came out of the Atomic Energy Commission, something the industry never said. However, let me revolutionize your thinking about charging stations. I'm not sure we need 240 volt or 480 volt charging stations. I think that every parking meter out here had a 120 volt outlet, and you can plug into it. The cost of putting in the 120 volt standard household outlet is approximately zero. And the amount of electricity that a car could take from it by being parked there 2 or 3 hours is also approximately zero. It's too cheap to meter. You got to think of it a little like we used to have payphones on the streets. They're cheap. You put them in, life gets better. The geography of the charging infrastructure is not now clear, partly because the density of electric vehicles is so low. But I could foresee a future where, as an amenity in your garage at work, in your garage at home, there was just a 110 volt outlet, and it only added 5 or 6 miles of range per hour of charge. But as you point out, the car sits unused 22 hours a day. That's plenty of time to recharge. Other questions?
I have another, if that's all right, since someone else has one. I'll phrase it slightly differently, a slightly different one for both of you, given your different places where you're coming from. The heart of the notice of proposed rulemaking is fuel resiliency, hopefully leading to greater resiliency of the overall electric power system. For you, my question is, as we move right now under market conditions towards really a monoculture of mostly gas, this introduces potentially new single points of failures. I live in New England. A lot of the gas that we get comes from a single gas pipeline that's not governed by N-1 contingency constraints right now. You advocated a lot for markets. Is there a place for government intervention here to support things that aren't being remunerated by the market and some type of diversity there? And for you, a similar question. Nuclear power plants are very resilient until they're not, and at which point they become actually liabilities for the grid in terms of needing off-site power to facilitate cooling during a shutdown. Right. Do you see a resiliency hazard in terms of also having a single point of failure for a large amount of power in a nuclear power plant? So 2 resiliency-oriented questions for both of you.
Great question. So first, I agree with you about some issues with natural gas. I showed a chart of natural gas prices, for the most part, declining since the fracking boom began in 2007, 2008. There's no question that the rush to gas that we're seeing and will continue to see is based primarily on the cost of the fuel. And right now, it's projected that natural gas will remain inexpensive, but there are a lot of variables that could change that. And if that changes in a hurry, we're not talking about adequate pipeline capacity, we're talking about energy affordability. So do I see a role for government? I was a big fan of the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. That was the EPA rule based on the 2007 Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA. What the Clean Power Plan did was it said, for the first time, we're going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from the electric power sector, from existing facilities. But we're not going to do it in a way that we're going to be regulating each facility. Instead, we're going to go state by state, utility by utility, and let them come up with their own plans to meet emission reductions through either improving efficiency at existing coal, or going to gas, or going to renewables, or investing in energy efficiency. The point is, the Clean Power Plan, if you weren't a partisan person looking at it, you'd say that is an incredibly achievable and moderate national plan that gives states flexibility to come up with an electricity planning system for the next 20 to 30 years. And I think that the demonization of that plan, we don't have that master plan. And so now you've got states coming up with their own climate change and renewable energy plans, which some of them are very good, but it's definitely preferable to have a national plan. And so the Clean Power Plan wasn't perfect, but I think we need to have some sort of framework in place as a guiding principle for investment. And I thought the Clean Power Plan actually did a lot of things very well, and it's really unfortunate that we're. Well, I think so. I mean, it didn't have a resiliency standard, but it first and foremost was addressing greenhouse gas emissions, which addressing climate change is a resilience issue. Now, the U.S. unilaterally doing greenhouse gas emission reductions isn't going to stop climate change, right? It's a global issue. But what the Clean Power Plan did was it gave the United States a tool to go to the rest of the world, and particularly to China, to do increasingly more aggressive international plans to address it. So I do think that there's a role for the feds addressing resilience. This NOPR is not it, but I do think it would have to be region by region. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
New England without Vermont Yankee is more vulnerable than it used to be. When Pilgrim goes, it'll be yet more vulnerable. It has unrecognized vulnerabilities to New Brunswick. One lost gas dryer in New Brunswick, and Central Maine Power is going to be in trouble. You are correct. I have up here this chart. Nuclear plants in the old days used to trip offline 3, 4, 5 times a year. Now the average plant trips off less than once a year. They don't operate in isolation. They do require offsite power. They are self-sufficient for extended periods without offsite power. Presuming you don't have a tsunami and you've designed the plant correctly, you're good for a month. And within a month, you could figure out something else to keep yourself going. And your need for offsite power declines steadily in the course of that month. Resiliency, I think we don't want to think of the United States as breaking up into total anarchy. The backup plans you make are not in case all hell breaks loose. It's to give you time to figure out what you do next. We've never had a circumstance where we have extended outages, for month after month. I've read some of that literature. I've read some of the postulations. I've read some contradictions to those postulations. I think EMP is a really sexy idea, but I'm not certain how serious a problem it is. And I can, if you want after this, talk to you about this going back into the early 1980s or the late 70s, as a matter of fact.